Lesson 3 in the worksheets. And it is out of 1 Samuel chapter 16, where we'll spend a good bit of our time. We trying in this particular study, this isn't, for lack of a better way to say it, this isn't a historical study. This isn't about who was the first king, who was the second king, who was the third king, that kind of thing. This study is an attempt to look at these moments in history and say, what do I learn from it? What is there that's happening among these individuals? Because remember, the basic theme of the study is a man after God's own heart. Why was Saul not a man after God's own heart? And why was David considered a man after God's own heart? What's the contrast between the two? What's the character? What's the decision making? What is it about them that kind of lets us understand what it means to be a man after God's own heart? And so if you wonder why I'm not really dealing with the historical side or dates and things of that sort, because that's not the study. The study is about trying to pull from these moments the things that can help us in our practical walk and relationship with God, that we too could be people that have hearts that are being led by our Creator. In this particular chapter, where is Samuel, or let me ask it this way, what's Samuel doing?
He's going to anoint David.
Okay, he's going to anoint David. Is that going to be a safe thing for him to do? No, it's not going to be a safe thing for him to do. And so he actually has to go under the guise of what? Of sacrifice. That he can go and do legitimately, and nobody will really ask much or say much about it. And so for his own safety in some senses, he goes, and you might call that a bit of deception, but that's the reality of the circumstance, that if it had been known by Saul that Samuel was officially going up to officially anoint David as king, what would Saul have done? He would have done everything to stop that. And so he uses this cloak of work. And by the way, did they make sacrifice? Yeah, they did. And so, but he uses that cloak of normalcy, if you will, in order to be able to get up there to anoint David. He shows up. He knows where to go, right? Where's he supposed to go? The household of Jesse, right? But there's a problem when he gets there. What's the problem? Yeah, well, but also the fact that there's more than one. He doesn't know which one, right? He doesn't know which of those 8 that it's going to be. 7 of them are created by, and it takes till you get to finally the youngest, to get to David, who actually in many senses was the most unlikely, right? And so it almost befuddled Samuel in some ways that it took to get clear down to David in order to finally find the one who was actually the selection that come from God. In fact, Eliab, I believe if you pronounce that right, he was kind of just assumed initially that he must be the one that God would intend. But that's not at all what happened. So he's there anointing David. He's there to kind of set a greater stage, though these things have already been put in the works in the plans of God. Saul, for his behaviors, is from a practical standpoint, has already been rejected from Jehovah. And now we've gotten to the point where Samuel is doing some official duties, if you will, as it relates to anointing David. And so that's where we are. I'm going to jump straight to the questions in most of these studies, give you a brief reminder of the history, and then dive in and see the practical side of the study. And so at the end of chapter 15, the beginning of chapter 16, Samuel was what? He's in mourning, right? He's mourning Saul, but the problem is Saul is still alive. So why would you mourn somebody who's still alive?
God taking the kingdom from him.
Okay, and so okay, so there's a couple of elements here. He's mourning over his disobedience. You can even say, as Bob did a minute ago, in some senses, his reign is already dead in the eyes of God. It's already been put asunder. in the eyes of God. Yeah, there's some years that are going to have to go by. There's some history that's going to have to unfold. But as it relates to God, and Samuel recognizes this, that the first king has ended in failure. And Samuel's mourning the fact that Saul did not maintain a heart and relationship to Jehovah. The point I want us to recognize out of that is that it's...
Samuel kind of just blaming himself for it.
Well, I don't know. I can't get into his mind as far as all the motivations behind it. But the point is that this is sad. To see one that had been chosen to be king, who started out very humble, who started out with great promise, and then all of a sudden his choices and decisions begin to fail. He becomes very self-centered in his processes. And it's sad to see somebody who was once engaged in a relationship with the Creator who turns away. It should bring us to mourning when there are those who leave their love for the Lord. It should bring sadness to us to see those who once loved and served and were committed to the Creator and to His Son, who have chosen for whatever reason to abandon that relationship. I concern myself sometimes with the fact that maybe we see that so much that it becomes normal, if that's a fair word. We become very complacent in the idea because we see it so often, and we become maybe almost complacent, and we almost just say, well, there they go, there goes another one. But there needs to be a deeper sense that when people turn their hearts away from God, that should bring sadness and mourning in the mindset of those who love the Lord. It should never become normal to us to see folks turn away from their relationship with God. It should never appear to be something that's acceptable or even in some senses understandable. We should never have the thought process of well, even the idea of I told you so, like I almost expected them to fail. I never thought that was going to work. You ever said that about someone? They step into the promises of God, they obey the gospel, and you say, I don't know what they're doing. Who are they for, right? And our expectations about people's success in their relationship with God are diminished. We need to raise the bar and have greater expectations. And when it doesn't reach the heart of God that He would desire, then that should sadden us, and sadden us in a way that we should react to it.
Jesus said in the Beatitudes, blessed are they that mourn. That's mourning over sin. Yeah. So Samuel is mourning over the sins of Saul, his stubbornness, his rebellion, the rejection of God's word, and that's what I see.
Yeah. Yeah, and somebody doesn't have to die for there to be legitimate mourning about that person and the situation that they're in.
I think you see a little bit of God in Samuel too, that Samuel takes this loss almost personally. And it's the same thing as Jesus said in the parable of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and lost boy. God takes loss personally.
Yeah. And I suppose you could add the idea that there's mourning here too in the fact that Samuel, when the people came and said, your sons are horrible, we want a king instead. And Samuel's in mourning then over that. And God says, Samuel, don't weep for yourself. This is really about a rejection of my plan. And God says, but give them a king anyway. It's going to come back to haunt them, but go ahead and give them a king anyway. And maybe there's a heart here within Samuel that's mourning over the fact that just as God had said, it's unfolding. And the rejection of God and His original pattern and purpose here. And now here we are, already having to anoint a new king over us.
Samuel had no idea how long Saul was going to remain king, did he?
No, not to my knowledge. That he he doesn't know all the timings of the events in which God's purposes will be fulfilled.
That may have been one of the reasons why he thought one of the older boys would be better, because he was of age then to take over.
Yeah. So let's look at a couple of other individuals. The question's asked then, how did these men become disappointments, if only temporarily? What did Moses do? Okay. And why was that wrong? There's twofold reasons that's wrong. One was, it wasn't not what God said to do. Yeah. And then he didn't give honor to God when it occurred. People after God's heart then do the opposite. Number one, they obey God's instructions. Number two, they give honor to whom honor is due. Men after God's heart respect and honor God for what He does and what He fulfills and what He provides and what He gives to each of us. And we lend ourselves to that kind of mindset. What did Peter do?
Denied Christ 3 times.
He denies Jesus in this scene. So what do people that are striving after God's heart? What would they do? What's the opposite? Confess. Right? Accept that relationship. Be bold in that and even in moments where you're afraid and fear for your own, Peter's fearing for his own safety. If he acknowledges. The one they're asking him to acknowledge is in a courtroom that really the truth is everybody knows is just a ruse to have him put to death. And so Peter understands the danger that he's in, but men after God's heart will accept the consequences of confessing, acknowledging God in any circumstance, regardless of what might come to them or what might occur in that relationship. What about John Mark? What was his circumstance? Okay. So he left when they were depending on him. Men after God's heart do everything they can to be dependable. Now, does John Mark get past this? Yes. Does Peter get past it? Yes. Did Moses get past it? Yeah. I think we could argue that he does. Is he saddened over it that he doesn't get to see the promised land? Because sure he is. But what did he do? Did he go out and feel sorry for himself? No, he educated the people and prepped and made them ready to go in and take the promised land when the right time was come. So the lesson learned maybe within all of these, and especially these three, and that's why I stopped at this point, is that even when my heart fails to honor God when it should, doesn't mean I have to remain on that path. Moses disobeyed. He failed to give proper honor to God. But he doesn't let that moment of failure in heart and in relationship to God keep him away from continuing to serve. Peter, horrible denial. Even after he was what? What did he know before it ever happened? That he was going to do. He's told it was going to happen. I mean, what to me, there's an extra edge of sadness to Peter. Because not only does he deny Jesus 3 times, but he was told ahead of time, you're going to do this. And he still does, even though in the initial moment that Jesus spoke to him, he vehemently says, there's not a chance in the world I'd die for you. But that really wasn't the case. Go ahead, Jim.
Did they all pay consequences?
You could Moses did. Got left out of the promised land. I think Peter's consequence may have been just the deep sorrow when he goes out and weeps bitterly after that scene. John Mark comes back, does some great things, writes the gospel account, but Paul didn't trust him anymore, right? He honored, he respects it, but when the discussion comes back up, when the second trip's coming up and they have a conversation about who's going, remember Barnabas and Paul didn't see eye to eye about whether John Mark should be on that trip or not. And what happened? They just said, well, let's just go two different directions. I'll take John Mark and we'll take Titus over here. And so in some senses, they all suffer consequences, and yet all still had the ability to stay in relationship with God and come back into relationship with Him. And that's the key in some ways, the lesson here. When we're striving to be people after God's heart, and striving to have hearts that are committed and dedicated to our Creator, we can't let moments of failure define us. And we've got to be willing to say, okay, that wasn't a heart that it should have been. And so what do I need to do to make changes and improve? And there's evidence Peter made changes and improved. John Mark made evidence of changes and improved. And Moses went on to do the work that God still had planned for him to fulfill. And that's what we need to remember as well. We can be overburdened with the sorrow of our mistakes and throw our hands up and quit. Or we can acknowledge that's not what God would have desired from a man after God's own heart, and how can I improve to move forward from this moment? And those are, to me, just from anecdotally over the years dealing with folks, those are those moments of decision in a lot of people's lives where it defines those early challenges to your faith and how you let it define you and which direction do you go. Do I let it cause me to stop, or do I let it motivate me to improve and grow? Demas, it seems that he just kind of said, I'm done. There's no other indication from in the narrative. For he loved this. He loved this present world, 1 Timothy 4, 2 Timothy 4, verse 10. It tells us his heart had been given back over to the world. And here's a man.
End of the story then.
Yeah, as far as we know, I mean, there's no other biblical evidence of anything other. And so here's a moment where a person seems to have hit a crisis of faith and made a decision to abandon rather than try to improve. So we've got to make choices in those moments.
I found a place in Colossians where it talks like he was at the beginning, he was in it, and but then he just fell away.
Yeah, you see him referenced in Paul's letter to Colossae in a positive way about how he's purposefully helping in the cause. But then you see his letter later written to Timothy concerning that he had left that initial passion and commitment.
One thing about Saul, he was repentant of Samuel afterwards, but he did not get the opportunity because God had already made the decision that there would be another king.
Yeah.
So he couldn't go on like Moses did.
Well, and I'm going to slightly disagree with you, Bob, on that. He could have. He doesn't know how much longer he's going to be. He can't retain the throne once God. And Moses could not retain the promised land. But both of them had a choice to move from that moment forward doing the right things. And Saul could have let legitimate repentance take forth and actually just serve and honor God to the best of his ability until God decides it's time for you to leave and David comes on. What Saul did is the exact opposite. Saul took every moment that he could from that point forward to find a way to try to continue to stop God's plan. I see him more as Demas in this picture because of his decision making. You're right, he can't reverse the throne decision, but he could have chosen to do right and let God's plan unfold as he would desire to.
And I wonder, in Deuteronomy, Moses set forth the laws that God had given him about being a king over Israel when they went to the promised land. Moses had already made his statement that what they needed to do, what the laws was, and they was to the king when he would go into the throne, supposed to have written a scroll of the laws that God had set forth about a king. Basically, that he wasn't better than what the people was, and he was to be humble. We don't have no record of whether Saul wrote that scroll or not to keep himself, within the bounds of what God wanted. But I kind of wonder maybe he didn't do this, and he more or less set himself up higher than what the people was.
Yeah, and certainly is evidence of that in his conduct.
There's no record of demons ever coming back, is there?
Not to my knowledge. So why was Samuel sent to Bethlehem? Okay. So notice verse 2 of 1 Samuel chapter 16. Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hear it, he will what? He'll kill me." Saul finds out I'm going up to officially anoint David king. He'll try to find a way to kill me. And the Lord said, "Take an heifer with thee and say, I am come to sacrifice to the Lord." Now, I didn't talk about this earlier when we just simply referenced it, but let me just give you a small snippet here. The reason I feel Samuel was in the right in this mode of how it is he's going about going up to anoint David is that he's doing it based on what? What God told him to do. Samuel didn't decide on his own, well, I guess maybe if I sneak up there with an animal for sacrifice, and this wasn't a plot of Samuel. This was God saying, I hear you, Samuel. Saul's a dangerous man. Take a heifer with you, and when you get up there, make sacrifice, and you'll be able to use that as a cloak that will hide the other purpose of going up there. And when you get there, call Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show thee what thou shalt do, and thou shalt anoint unto me him whom I name unto thee. So Samuel did that which the Lord spoke, and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the town trembled. When Samuel shows up, it's generally not good. There's something going on that you needed him to come. And so he shows up and they tremble at the fact that he is there. And said, "Comest thou peaceably? Is this a good thing or a bad thing? Why are you here, Samuel?" And he said, "Peaceably. I am come to sacrifice unto the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." And he sanctified Jesse and his sons and called them to the sacrifice. And so he goes up there, fulfilling the purposes and plans of God, and ultimately to seek the one who had chosen. That God had chosen. God gets to define what it means to be a man after God's own heart. I think that's an aspect of this study that we need to appreciate. That because generally speaking, from a lot of perspectives, men have kind of manipulated that into a thinking that almost says that we get to define what that is. That we get to create, here's a list of things that we believe that makes a man after God's heart. But that's not the case. How it is determined whether a person is a man after God's own heart or not is defined by the Creator, not the Creator. And part of our challenge sometimes, religiously and from our building a relationship with God, is that we are always sometimes trying to define the terms by which that we're going to have this relationship. I want to have a relationship with God, and I believe A, B, and C are what are necessary in order to have that. And God says, no, I get to choose A, B, and C. I get to choose the criteria, if you will, of what qualifies a man after God's own heart. So Samuel go up there, and when you get there, he tells him the family to invite, but he says, then I'll name it. You're not going to have to choose, Samuel. You're not going to have to look down through there and figure out which one of these guys is the man after God's own heart that he's looking for. I'm going to name him for you. And you're going to be able to accomplish this. So he uses the sacrifice as a means by which to get there under peaceable circumstances outside of the threat of Saul. And Samuel makes an assumption. What is it? Yeah. It came to pass, notice verse 6, when they were come, that he looked on Eliab and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said unto Samuel, what? Don't look at his stature and the way he appears. Look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as man seeth. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on what? On the heart. Samuel, this is not about a decision of which one of these sons looks like a king. The fact of the matter is they probably all, if put in the proper frame, could look what? Like a king. Is David described as the ugly duckling of the family, and that's why he's chosen? No. That's the point is the appearance of something can be different than the heart of something. I don't want to look like a Christian. I want to be a child of God, a Christian. I don't want the appearance, okay? Because the truth is, from a human standpoint, from a neighbor-to-neighbor standpoint, can I give the appearance of being a Christian but be far from it? Sure. I can do the kinds of things that give the appearance of something. And put that into any category, by the way. You can make yourself look like the appearance of something. But the heart is really where the matter is. It doesn't, at the end of the day, I want to be the right kind of influence in my neighborhoods, in my communities, within my family. I want to be the right kind of influence. And so I want to present myself as a child of God. Those are important aspects. But at the end of the day, I have to be more concerned about what God sees genuinely in me, more so than what I show myself to be unto others. And if I become consumed with solely the idea of what the others see me as, then I may fail to really build the kind of heart and relationship with God that I need. What does God think of me? That's a much deeper and more important question. And that can only be answered when comparing my heart and my soul to the pattern of Scripture. It's the only way those things can be determined.
That was one of the reasons that Saul was picked, because of his appearance. I think the head taller than everybody.
Right. And so you can make some contrast there in relationship to Saul and David.
Right. When you're evaluating a person, sometimes you look into his eyes, and we're talking about countenance when we talk about that, because that inward part around the eye that indicates thoughts, inward thoughts and feelings. And ruddy, on the other hand, when it describes David, is a fair complexion.
Yeah.
So his countenance was good. You know, we say sometimes we look at a person, I can see the ornament in your eye.
Yeah.
Or we look at a person and I know what you're thinking. That's what that is. And ruddy here is fair complexion. So I kind of view David as a handsome young man.
Yeah. Yeah. And probably one that people would be drawn to in connection to that. And so the point simply is Samuel, you might be able to find that from Eliab to David. You might find that kind of thing in any of the sons. But what I'm looking for is the son who has my heart, not just the son who would look good in a crown. And that's the danger. And the fact of the matter, here's just kind of a side, interesting aspect of that to me. Has that changed? No. Here we are, right? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later. And people are still looking where? On the outward appearance. People are, hundreds of years later, we still use the outward appearance as a measuring stick. And God has tried to explain to people forever through His Word that that's not a good determination of anything. And so we need to be careful that we're more concerned about the inward being. And the truth is, if we concentrate on the heart and being the heart of a man after God's own heart and having the kind of mind, then we will give the right kinds of influences and we'll give the right outward expressions of that if we start from the inside out. But if we're trying to decorate the outside without building the heart, then God says that's not going to be of any value. Go ahead, Jim.
The actions of a man will also show what his heart is, what's in his heart, what he does.
Yeah. Yeah, it isn't a matter of not having influence. It's a matter of building from the inside out and making sure that we work on what we should be first.
How different would our life be in the lives of others if we could see as God sees? If we could actually see, take away the physical and actually see the heart and the spirit of an individual.
Yeah, and there's some truth to that, Jonathan. And I think too, with though from a personal perspective, I think that honesty, we'll never be able to fully know the full intent and heart and motivation of every man that we encounter. There'll be times where we see certain evidences that point us in a direction, but the key is, for me personally, I can know if I'm honest, I can know what kind of heart I have, and a truthfulness about that will be important, and a willingness to be brutally honest sometimes about where my heart and my relationship with God is, and where do I stand, and then take His narrative and examine my heart and relationship to it, and be willing to accept those answers, and then make a choice to continue on a path that strengthens that relationship or to abandon it. So what's the real danger in judging by appearances?
You make the wrong choice.
Okay. So our choices won't be well made. Let's look at a couple of these texts real quick. Let's start in John chapter 7. Verse 24. And let me just take a brief moment, because I'm not going to have time to look at all these. So let me just take a moment with this one. I want you to see something first. Let's notice the conversation. Sometimes we jump to verse 24 and we don't look at why it was said. Who's teaching, by the way? Jesus. We know that because the letters are read. But anyway, Moses therefore, verse 22, Moses therefore gave unto you circumcision, not because it is of Moses, but of the fathers. And ye on the Sabbath day circumcise a man. If a man on the Sabbath day receives circumcision, that the law of Moses should not be broken, are you angry at me? Because I have made a man every whit whole on the Sabbath day. What's Jesus' point?
Circumcised.
Yeah, so we're not supposed to do anything on the Sabbath day. But if the 8th day of that child happened to fall on the Sabbath day, I'm in a bit of a decision-making mode. Can I go ahead and follow the law of circumcision, even though it happens to fall on the Sabbath day? That's the premise that Jesus sets forth. And then notice what He says. Now He says, verse 24, judge not according to the appearance, but judge righteous judgment. Don't get in this conundrum of which law is superior? And He says, just judge righteous. Use righteous judgment about what you should do in relationship to this. Exactly. And Jesus has taught that illustration in Mark's account in particular. And so be careful that you don't just look on the surface and say, oh, this has to be, or that has to be, and we make these wide sweeping decisions and choices. Be careful that you look a little deeper than that. Not just what appears to be right, but stop and take enough time to make a righteous judgment about what God would really approve of in a particular circumstance. Can I take the whole of everything God has said and make a better judgment rather than just kind of looking on the surface and saying, well, I guess I'm going to have to sin one way or the other, right? That's the mindset of them. Which sin do I want to commit? Do I want to ignore the 8th day or do I? No, Jesus says, judge righteously. Think about this and examine what really was God saying about the Sabbath and what the laws that He established them on. But key for us is that phrase, judge not according to the appearance of things. Even when I've got choices that appear to be, better or worse or better or best and those kinds of things, I should say. How does God choose? What's He examine? Yeah. He examines the inward man in order to fulfill those things. So who gets chosen? Sorry. Out of the 8 sons, David gets chosen. And how did he appear? That's back to what Randy was talking about a little earlier. As far as we can understand those terms, here's a good-looking young man. He fits that kind of bill, but he was deeper than that. And that's ultimately evidenced in what conduct? And in what initial moment do we think of David? Where do we think of David kind of coming out? With Goliath, right? There was a man after God's heart who recognized that his God was bigger than the problem in front of him. The armies of the Israelites had no heart to go fight the giant. And David comes along and recognizes that his character and his heart and relationship to his Creator can aid him and help him, and his faith and his commitments already being evidenced even in those early stages. Why did God choose him? Not because he was better looking than the rest of his brothers. He chose him because of the heart that he had and the evidence of that heart that had already been seen and would be seen moving forward.
Well, the soldiers around him when he was standing there, who's this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Yeah. You show his acceptance and trust in God there.
You think about the contrast. Saul would have taken that personal. Who are they to defy me? David said, who are they to defy God? And there's a difference in those two.
God said David would do my will.
Yeah. And so his heart is already dedicated to that purpose. He's not going to be perfect. We'll see that before we're done. But it's the kind of heart that he had that allowed for him to be chosen among God's people. So then what does it take from us? Go back to 1 Samuel chapter 16. First Samuel chapter 16 and verse 13. He said, Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah to let the Spirit of the Lord lead us. That's the heart of a man who wants to honor God. Needs to let the Spirit of the Lord lead it. Let the guidance and the path and the light of God be the motivator to our choices and our decisions and the things that we do. Let's stop worrying solely about the way things look and start being more concerned about how they are affecting the inward man and how God would want us to choose that heart and dedication of purpose to Him first. Any leftover thoughts or comments about... Another minute here. I was going to show you something if I can get my screen to cooperate here for a minute. I'll shut it off so it doesn't do something crazy. There was something I found the other day. My bell's going to ring before I can find it. I should have pulled it up ahead of time. I didn't think I'd have time to get to it. that my dad wrote. And I may have to show it to you. And yeah, I knew I didn't have time, and I didn't realize it. I'll show it to you someday. It's interesting. He wrote a composite. If you were to judge people on appearance, and he created the perfect preacher, and he used a composite of preachers that the older folks in the room would know. The younger generation wouldn't have any clue who most of these guys are. But I found it kind of interesting because he was trying to illustrate the point that if you judged on appearance, then you would have to kind of go take a piece of this and a piece of that and a piece of this and to try to create what you thought was the perfect looking preacher. And I thought it was an effective way to illustrate to quit looking on the appearance, because you're never going to find the perfection that you're looking for if you're looking from that perspective. Yeah. If you saw me down here in camel's hair eating locusts, actually, if you do find me down here, take me somewhere, because there's something wrong. Yeah.